Hello everybody, welcome to your lesson on adopted children. Now this is another step towards mastering the family class, and remember that we're splitting up this huge topic of the family class into more manageable portions as they relate to your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. Now you're going to be surprised with adopted children that it's quite a big topic, and it relates to quite a few international agreements that Canada has. You would have discussed this very thoroughly in your immigration practitioners course, wherever you took it. What we're going to do, of course, in these videos is just help you to refresh that knowledge, but in the context of preparing for your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. Now, as always, you have two really good resources provided by the IRCC. I would say OP3 is the best one, so be sure to really work through OP3. It's full of really important tiny little details, and the best part of it is that it was updated in November 2015. So I know when you look at some of the other OPs and IPs and manuals, sometimes they're really out of date, but in the case of adopted children, this one is up to date. Of course, the website from the CIC is a great starting point as well, and by combining the two of these with this video, of course, you should really give yourself a great base of knowledge to work with in terms of incorporating your general knowledge about adopted children into exam preparation. Now these other resources talk about this as well. So OP2, IP2, they both talk about adopted children a little bit. Most often they actually just refer you to OP3. But again, OP2 and IP2 are really good just to give you a bit more general knowledge about the procedures involved in the family class as a whole. There's two other sections of the IRCC website as well, which work really well in, again, giving you that general knowledge, because if you remember all of these little pieces of family class, so spouses, the lonely family member that we saw before, children, dependent children, adopted children, orphans, etc. Those all play a role in the exam, and of course they all play a role in your knowledge of each of these elements. So if you really master only one program, then you might not have an easy time when you're going into the exam. That's why you want to take a look at this as a whole, but of course we're splitting this up into manageable portions. Now, your IRPA and regulations have quite a lot of articles and regulations on this specific topic. The way that those articles are worded can be a little bit confusing, so again we'll just break this down and make it straightforward, just to give ourselves a little bit of a refresher in terms of preparing for the ICCRC Full Skills Exam. So one piece of the puzzle that we need to look at has to do with the Hague Convention. Now this would play a role in adoptions. It's one of the big international agreements that Canada is a part of. Now in terms of your exam, this is pretty good because it plays a role in government, so government agreements, which might be on your exam. And just by having a good general knowledge of this, it helps us, of course, in covering one area of your exam, which is government agreements, and another one, which is adoptions. So in general, this is a big agreement that a lot of countries in the world signed, and the section that we're specifically looking at is section 33 of this. Now this makes sure, basically this agreement makes sure that there are safeguards there, so that there isn't any child trafficking or anything illegal happening between countries when people of one country want to adopt children of another country. So it's a way of really systematizing adoptions and making sure that everybody has the same procedures and mostly the same laws regarding adoptions. So let's take a look at how this Hague Convention relates to Canada, and specifically in terms of adoption and immigration. Now you can see over here, this is all from OP3 by the way, that basically this convention ensures quite a few things on the side of the country that is sending the child to the other country. Now one of those things is to make sure that the child can be adopted. So legally, the child is able to be adopted. Now there are institutions and authorities that are specifically in charge of adoptions in countries that are Hague Convention signatories. Now what these authorities do is they make sure that the sending country is following what they need to follow as members or as signatories of the Hague Convention. Okay, so they're making sure that everything is legal, that of course the child is consenting to being adopted, and in terms of being legal, everything has to be expressed in writing, of course. Now they need consent from the child, of course, but they also need consent from the birth parents. So the birth parents have to consent that they are giving up their legal rights to the child and ceasing that legal relationship. What these authorities do as well is make sure that the reason the child is not up for adoption is not for business, of course. And that's where the human smuggling aspect comes in. So they have to make sure that the child is not being sent for adoption in order for somebody to make money. Okay, and of course that when the child consents to being adopted, it's given freely, so they're not being pressured by anybody or anything like that, and of course that consent is legal. So those are the legal obligations of the country sending the child to another country. Okay, now we'll take a look at the receiving country, and in this case, in terms of your ICCRC Full Skills Exam, this will be Canada. So the receiving country, as a signatory to the Hague Convention, has to have some authorities that make sure that the parents are suitable and eligible to adopt a child. And of course they have to make sure that the child is legally allowed to enter and remain in the country. In the cases that we'll see, of course, in terms of preparing for your full skills exam, that would be Canada. Now there's one final piece of this element here, and this is where we jump in with immigration, really. Now the adoption can only be finalized after both the sending and receiving countries have verified the information. And that's where we get into the immigration side of this. Now the reason we talked about this, of course, is because it gives you a broader picture of adoption. And what we're going to really focus on now is how adoption relates to immigration. So let's take a look at the procedures that a sponsor would go through in order to bring an adopted child into Canada in terms of immigration. Alright, so very generally speaking, you'd have the adoption process. So we touched on this just a tiny little bit. We'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later on. So the adoption process is the first step. Now that would involve, of course, finding a child they want to adopt, making sure that their house is eligible, all that type of stuff. The immigration process is where we need to focus on as RCICs and for you, of course, as ICCRC Full Skills Exam takers. Now in the immigration process, we're going to see that there are two possible outcomes. So one is permanent residency and one is citizenship right away. So we'll touch on both of these just a little bit after we talk about the immigration process. So when we are looking at this process, you could think of it like this. When you look at OP3 and your acts and regulations and the government websites that have to do with adoption and of course the IRCC websites, you might get a little bit confused, but what we're going to do is just take a look at this strategically and we'll see the role that each party here plays in adoption, but most importantly, the immigration side of this. So as a first step, you'd have the sponsor. Now the sponsor would find somebody that he wants to adopt and would work together with the provincial adoption authorities to make sure that he has approval from them to adopt a person. Now those provincial adoption authorities would first of all make sure that he can actually adopt someone. Now they're taking a look, of course, at the same things that we look at in immigration, right? So criminal record, if the person makes enough money, if the person has enough space in his house, if he can support this child or this person he's adopting. Now, if the person meets the adoption requirements in terms of what the provincial adoption authority is looking for, then they take a look at whether or not the person that the sponsor wants to adopt is from a Hague country or a non-Hague country. Now, if the child is from a Hague country, then the provincial authorities would request written consent from his or her counterpart in the other country. Because remember, as Hague signatory countries, they have to have authorities in charge of adoption. So this provincial authority would request written consent to adopt, or for the sponsor to adopt this child. Now, if the adoptee or the person that the sponsor wants to adopt is from a non-Hague country, then it's slightly different. So the provincial authority would request a letter of non-objection from that country. That means that the country doesn't object to the sponsor sponsoring a child and taking a child out of the country as an adoptee. They also, of course, this is for everything really, but there has to be evidence or no evidence of anything illegal happening. So that would include, of course, human trafficking and that kind of thing. If everything's okay, that written consent or the letter of non-objection would make its way back, and then they work together on the application for immigration. Now that would go to the IRCC officer, and if everything's okay, he would inform them that everything's okay, and in terms of the immigration side. Finally, the provincial authority would work with his counterpart in another country to finalize the adoption. Alright, so this is really a step-by-step analysis of the processes that people go through in terms of adoption. We'll take a look at the legal text in the next couple of slides as well, just to, again, reinforce this. Now, in terms of your ICCRC Full Skills Exam, remember that, of course, your exam is on immigration, not adoption. The adoption step isn't exactly about immigration. So even though we talked about it a little bit, that was just to give you sort of a holistic view of adoption as it relates to immigration. Now, the adoption side of this would only play an indirect role in your exam. And of course, that would only be in the context of how it relates to immigration. Because remember that the person who wants to adopt, they're looking for a child on their own. They're dealing with the provincial authority on their own as well. And again, just for your general knowledge, there are some countries that Canadian provinces don't allow adoptions from, and there are some other countries in the world that don't allow adoptions. So this would be, of course, where the federal authorities come in, just to make sure that in terms of the immigration side, they can actually get permanent residence or a visa for the child who is going to be adopted in order to leave the country. So let's take a look at OP3 and the instructions given to officers who receive an application for immigration with regard to adoption. Now, this is everything that we talked about in the previous example when we saw the four people. We saw the sponsor, the provincial adoption authority, his or her counterpart in the other country, and the IRCC officer. So we saw those general steps on the procedures involved with immigration and adoption. But when we dig a little bit deeper, we could see that these are the steps even further. So the first thing that they would do is just match up the application and the notice of agreement from the province. There are those medical requirements, just like everybody else immigrating. The medical requirements in terms of adopting someone are a little bit different. Now, we're going to talk about this in a couple minutes. Okay, so they need to notify those provincial adoption authorities as to whether or not the child being adopted meets the immigration requirements. Remember that if the child doesn't meet the immigration requirements, then in terms of immigration, it stops right there. Okay, if that notification is positive, then the provincial adoption authority will notify his or her counterpart in the other country where the person being adopted is coming from. Then they would finalize that adoption. With the immigration authority as well, so another step for them is to make sure that the sponsors actually have the authority to take the child to Canada. And of course, with regard to the Hague Convention, those adoptions must be confirmed and approved by the country of origin, and also the country where the person being adopted is going to. So remember, in your exam, it's important to know the procedures, of course, that are happening during the immigration process. Now, when there is an adoption from a non-Hague country, the procedures are slightly different. So you can see right away that there are those medical requirements, just like with almost every other immigration program. Okay, a home study. Now that just means that the provincial adoption authorities took a look at the person's home to see if he or she, or they, can have a child living there. Now there's a letter of no objection from the province, and that would just say that they do not object to the sponsor adopting a person. The sponsor just has to confirm that that letter exists, of course, with the provincial authorities before they move into the immigration side of this. And the immigration authorities would have to verify that the sponsor is actually legally allowed to take the child to Canada. Now that would be, of course, based on something from the other country, so maybe an adoption order, a custody order. They would obviously make sure that those immigration requirements are met, and that the child can actually travel, so with a valid travel document. So that puts a close to the section on those general procedures regarding adopting children and having those children immigrate to Canada. What we'll focus on now are the requirements for those children, so who can be adopted, who cannot be adopted. So we have to take a look at the regulations again, and you'll notice that with adoption, one of the trickiest parts about this topic is to correlate all of the information out there into one manageable source. So we have to take a look, of course, at your IRPA, your regulations, the IRCC website, and OP3. Now we're going to see that a lot of those tools have a lot of the pieces of the puzzle, but there are some pieces where you have to kind of dig in to other areas in order to find out and clarify adoption and how it relates to immigration. So when we go back to Regulation 3 and we take a look at those definitions provided in the regulations, we can see this definition of adoption in front of you. Now, just like all the other definitions that we see, there are a lot of little tiny words in here that really count for a lot. So one of those ideas, of course, is that the adoption creates a legal parent-child relationship. And another important one is that it severs the pre-existing legal parent-child relationship. In terms of your ICCRC Full Skills Exam, that is a great, tricky little area for you to think about and just to be aware of. So a child who's adopted and gains permanent residency or citizenship in Canada through this adoption, he or she cannot sponsor any of his blood relatives later on as family members. Because essentially with the adoption, as we could see in the second half of the first sentence, it severs that pre-existing legal parent-child relationship. Now when we dig into Regulation 2 and we see the definition of dependent child, we could see that adopted child plays a role in this definition as well. So it means a child who is the adopted child of the parent and meets the other requirements there under B. So less than 19, not a spouse or common law partner, or is 19 or older, but dependent on the parents. We're going to come back to that little aspect in about 5 minutes as well, because again, it's another tricky little area that might come up on your exam. But from this, we could start to put together a little chart here And we can think of those general aspects, the general requirements, really, of a person being adopted in terms of immigration. So from Regulation 2, we can see that, of course, the person being adopted has to be 18 or under, not married or in a common law relationship. And if they're over 18, they would have to be physically or mentally handicapped, but to a certain point. That point would be where they cannot support themselves. Something else that is a little bit tricky in this topic of adopted children has to do with admissibility, and specifically with medical admissibility. So the person has to be, of course, medically admissible, but there is a slight little exception in there, and that has to do with excessive demand. So excessive demand does not play a role in making a person or an adopted child inadmissible in this specific area of family reunification. When we look at those medical requirements as well, the child has to take a medical test, of course, and the parents have to prove that they are aware of all of the medical issues regarding the child. This is, of course, to make sure that the parents know what they're getting into. If, for example, they adopt a child and the child maybe has mental issues or physical issues that they weren't aware of, then it might be difficult for the parents. So it's sort of a safeguard for that. But in terms of immigration, it gives us another little couple pieces of the puzzle when we look at who can immigrate and who cannot immigrate as an adopted child. So we could see that when we add on to the previous slide, we have a child who's 18 and under, or the person can be over 18, which means 19 and older, but physically or mentally handicapped, where they cannot financially support themselves. Remember, they have to not be married or in a common law relationship. They have to be medically admissible. The only exception, of course, with this is excessive demand. So if they're going to adopt a child and the child has, let's say, polio or something like that, where it might be a danger to the Canadian public, then that adopted child would be inadmissible medically. But let's say the child has a different disease, maybe diabetes or something like that, where it might cost the taxpayer $7,000, $8,000 per year. That in normal cases, that would maybe make the person inadmissible because of excessive demand. However, with an adopted child, excessive demand does not make an adopted child inadmissible. Okay, remember what we talked about before, where an adopted child later on in his life, after 20 years, 40 years, 100 years, that adopted child cannot sponsor his or her biological family, because remember that the adoption severs those ties legally. And a big one, you'll see this, of course, across immigration in general, across the family class in general. This can't be an adoption of convenience. Now that means that the adoption is for immigration purposes and not family purposes. And when we look at this generally, again, you'll see these concepts come up again and again in the regulations, in OP3, all over the IRCC website. And these give, again, a broader view of some of the requirements needed in order to adopt someone, but in order for that adopted person to get immigration. Now, the adoption, in assessing whether or not the adoption is genuine, the adoption obviously has to be in the best interests of the child. Now, this relates to the Hague Convention. And this is something that we talked about before, where it has to create a genuine parent-child relationship. Now, part of that is severing those legal ties to the biological parents. So as we talked about before, that means that the child cannot sponsor those biological parents or the rest of the biological family, really, at any point in the future, because legally they're not really his or her family anymore. Okay, so with adoption, the adoption has to be legal in both Canada, so whichever province that the parents live in, because those adoption authorities are provincial, and also where the adoption is taking place. And of course, that last point, that really goes with pretty much everything in immigration. So this can't be used as a way to bypass any other regular immigration stream. The adoption has to be a real adoption, and genuine, of course. And it can't be used just sort of as an immigration scheme. Okay, and you have all of your main points over here again. Now, a question that a few people had has to do with adult adoptions. So you'll see in Regulation 117.4 that there is a little section dealing with people who get adopted as adults. In real life, this is incredibly rare for someone to get adopted as an adult and to get their immigration through this adoption. But academically and theoretically, it is possible just in a very, very, very specific situation. Now, when we take a look at what we were just talking about in the previous slide, remember that the adoption has to be legal in both the country that the person is coming from and the province in Canada. Some provinces don't allow people to adopt people who are adults. A couple of the provinces do allow it, and a lot of countries in the world just don't allow it either. The key here is really that genuine parent-child relationship. So this has to have been established before the person turned 18, and it must continue to exist. So with an adult adoption, it's not someone who's friends with somebody and the friend maybe can't immigrate, so they adopt that person. It doesn't count like that, because they have to really prove there's a genuine relationship, a genuine parent-child relationship. Okay, and of course, just like everything else in immigration, the adoption can't be just for immigration. Now, when you look into OP3, they tell you that, again, this adoption for adults has to meet the definition of Regulation 2, and that definition of a dependent child. So with Regulation 2A, we can see that the person has to be the adopted child of the parent, which is extremely difficult and extremely rare for someone who's 18 or over. One of the only instances of this would be in B, where the person is 19 years or older, but is mentally or physically unable to support themselves. So that's one of the only little instances where a person would be able to adopt an adult, and to have that adoption in turn transition into immigration. Now, the only reason I bring this up is just because in Regulation 117, it's a pretty big couple of paragraphs that talk about this, and some people get confused about this. In real life, it's incredibly rare for this to happen, for people to adopt adults and have them in turn gain their immigration, because of course the person is an adult, and proving that the genuine parent-child relationship is there for someone who is older than 18 is extremely difficult and extremely rare as well. Now, once a person, of course, goes through those procedures, and assuming that both the sponsor and the person being adopted meet the requirements that we just talked about, there are two possible immigration outcomes. Now, one of those outcomes is for a person to gain permanent residency and then come to Canada and then most likely transition to citizenship. And another possible outcome has to do with citizenship. So where a person could get adopted, and at that point they're the dependent child of a Canadian, so they would maybe qualify for citizenship right away. Now for adoption, it's a little bit trickier. So when you're looking at permanent residency versus citizenship for someone who is immigrating as an adopted child, the parents and the history of the parents plays a pretty big role in whether or not that newly adopted child can gain citizenship right away or permanent residency. And of course, one of the other really important aspects to look at with this has to do with the first generation limit. We'll talk about this more when we work through citizenship in a later lesson. But the reason we're talking about this, of course, is just to see how it relates to adopted family members and their immigration projects. Okay, so for permanent residency, a parent who is adopting a child from a different country, if that parent is a citizen or a permanent resident who's living in Canada, or a citizen who lives abroad but will live in Canada in order to start, when the immigration process is complete, then that person can help his or her adopted child obtain permanent residency. Now, let's say that they want the child to gain citizenship right away. Then the sponsor has to be in a little bit of a different situation. So the adoptive parent has to be a Canadian citizen who's born in Canada or naturalized in Canada at the time of the adoption. So essentially, a permanent resident wouldn't be able to help their newly adopted child gain citizenship right away. Another really important element of this has to do with the first generation limit. Now, this does not apply to the person's children if those children were born outside Canada in terms of a permanent resident. However, this does apply if the adopted person's children were born outside Canada. So this is, of course, talking about in 30 years probably with the adopted person. So if that adopted person obtains permanent residency, and let's pretend that the person is 7 years old now, and let's say in 30 years or in 20 years that person has kids, if that adopted person at that point is a Canadian citizen, which he or she would most likely be, then those kids would be Canadian as well. Now, if that adopted person gains citizenship right away without obtaining permanent residency, then the first generation limit applies to this person. So if that adopted person has kids outside Canada, then those kids would not be Canadian citizens automatically. That is why on the website as well, the IRCC recommends for families, when they adopt children, to have the children obtain permanent residency first, and then transition to citizenship. And finally, just a note on refusal. of permanent residence status or citizenship status for these adopted children. Now, if the parents apply for permanent residency for the adopted child and it's refused, they have the right to appeal that decision before the IAD. If they apply for citizenship for that child and citizenship is refused, then they have the right to file for leave for judicial review. Now, this is, of course, assuming there is a case, right? Because you wouldn't recommend someone to file for leave for judicial review or file for an appeal if the decision was correct. Okay, well, a very big thank you again for tuning in. Adoption is one of the trickiest little areas of family class, and I'm happy that we got through it together. So have a really great day, and thank you again for tuning in.